I have a very brief kind of framing context. We're continually looking for ways to improve that part of what we do with our reports and with the meetings. Today was a bit rocky because we had 2 drugs and difficult to say what the comparators were. But most kind of technology assessment groups do even less work, I think, in trying to grapple with some of the harder intangible aspects of value. So it's still something that with the votes, it's important to make that a part of our record. And even the messiness of the discussion in some way is illuminating around where we do need better evidence and where the value equation could benefit from some different approaches. So anyway, that's part of what we're about, and I'm glad we got through that. All right, what we are going to do now is shift again to a policy roundtable. And so I'm going to note the time and try to script things because we do have some important issues to cover, but I need to also introduce at least two additional folks, maybe 3, to the roundtable. And the first would be Leslie Fish. Leslie, are you with us?
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, we can.
Hi, hopefully you'll be able to see me soon. Hi, I'm Leslie Fish. I'm from IPD Analytics, and we are a company that develops and maintains medication management and strategy. And I don't have anything to disclose. How's that?
Thanks, Leslie, and
Thanks.
Welcome again. And Jay McKnight, we know him as Jay. It says John up here. Jay, are you with us? All right, well, we will work on locating Dr. McKnight. Maybe I can ask the staff to reach out to him. Then do we have from the manufacturers, we have Rachel Dillon, I hope, or Rochelle, apologies.
Hi, that's right. Rochelle Dillon. I'm from Sesson Bio, and I'm currently the Director of Clinical Operations. All
right. I'm hoping to get to the right screen where I can see you, but right now I will have to just thank you for being here. And Kristen, I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name, so I'll let you do it.
Kristen Walksmith. I'm Senior Director of Medical Affairs and Clinical Development at FairTeam.
Okay. So folks, look at this list. What we have is we have our patient experts that we've had with us from the beginning, Stephanie and Karen. We've got our clinical experts. We have Aaron and John. And now we have 2 folks from the payer who know the payer community and in some sense can represent their way of thinking. And we have 2 of the manufacturers. Now, for the rest of the CEPAC, you can turn off your cameras if you want to, because that may make it a little bit easier to have others be able to highlight the folks on the policy roundtable. In the time we've got left, I'm going to try to do a quick tour of some of the key policy issues around insurance coverage, around pricing, the cost of these agents and what we think of how we're going to manage those, and then around the research, both the state of our current research, but especially kind of forecasting it into the future where we could try to lay out some guideposts for how we could improve and try to create certain standards around the kinds of evidence that patients, that doctors, that payers, everybody would like to see. But I'd like to start again kind of with a basic question that often comes up from a payer who will want to ask, call up a friend, call up a clinical expert and say, help me understand these new treatments. What's their role in therapy? Are they going to be used first? Are they going to be used last? Who are the patients who will choose one versus the other? What do I have to know about the variation in clinical practice here to help me understand what I should do with coverage and other things? So if I could start with the clinical experts maybe and just say, what variation would you expect to see in clinical practice? Don't try to tell us yet what's best, if there is one best approach, but what do you think? Is there going to be all over the map kind of approaches to using these different options? Is there going to be one kind of more standardized way, 2 or 3? What would you guys advise the future clinician, patient, and payer world about what it's going to look like? John, can I start with you?
Absolutely. I think there is a tremendous amount of, frankly, of uncertainty in thinking about how these therapies are going to be used sort of in routine clinical practice. part of the uncertainty about, the relative comparative effectiveness of these therapies with each other and with some of the existing chemotherapies that are currently being used in clinical practice is one of the challenges that we confront as clinicians trying to counsel patients through this. And so, we have been in a way oddly lucky in bladder cancer in that we've had that, few therapies. That's not a good thing, but it actually makes clinical decision making a little easier. And so I think it's not going to be very clear how we're going to disentangle, what's going to be our first line salvage treatment, what's going to be our second line salvage treatment. It is going to necessitate on the part of urologists a bit of shared decision making around things like the relative intensity of the installation schedule, the comparative effectiveness of something like an intravesical treatment versus an IV treatment on quality of life outcomes. A lot of these patients have a preceding history of fairly intensive intravesical treatments. And so, that sometimes weighs into the discussion. I mentioned on this call that I wasn't part of the trials for either of the two therapies we're talking about, but I was part of the pembrolizumab trial. And in that context, it was fairly easy to recruit patients for the trial because they were excited to not have another treatment into their bladder. And so I do think there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. I'm the PI of a large pragmatic trial in bladder cancer care. And as part of it, we did a survey of clinical experts on their preferred salvage therapies, and there was no consistency. And so different therapies had a tendency, or different clinicians, and these are expert bladder cancer clinicians, had a tendency to use different prioritized salvage treatments. And I think some of that is going to persist until we maybe have some sort of phase 4 data that helps us disentangle, when we can use these in the first line. I'm on the guidelines panel for kidney cancer for the NCCN. And on that guidelines panel, we literally, up until a couple of years ago, for first line therapy, just had a list of 15 therapies. And I think, unfortunately, right now in the salvage setting, we're going to kind of have a list of therapies.
So let me actually pivot quickly to the patients. So I'm listening with a patient's ear. I'm pretending to. You're the real patients. I either feel comforted by the fact that there are lots of options and I can talk through them with my doctor and make a personalized decision, or I'm anxious because there are options and I want somebody to tell me the right way, and I'm worried that if I go to the wrong doctor, I'm going to get told to do one treatment, but if I go to the Mayo Clinic, they'll do something else, and do I need to talk to 10 different doctors to get 10 different opinions, et cetera, et cetera. So what are patients going to look at, do you think? How are they going to view this, and how are they going to make their choice between the treatment options that we've been discussing today? Stephanie?
Karen, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure, I will. I mean, I think there are different camps of people. For me, I really wanted options, and I wanted to look at what was out there and what were going to be the clinical outcomes, as well as, what were the side effects. The BCG for me was very uncomfortable. And I was really fatigued. And even though I did work through the entire, all my treatments, I was dragging, really dragging. And so I would try very hard to schedule my treatments, on a Friday so that I would have the whole weekend to recover. And, most of my providers were able to accommodate me. But I guess maybe Stephanie can talk about some of the folks that she talks to as to, whether they feel like they would rather have more choices or less.
Thanks.
Well, Beacon started in 2005 because there were really very few treatment options back that early. BCG was a big thing that was really approved 40 years ago, and for a long time there was nothing else. So you had BCG, and if that didn't work, then you're kind of like, okay, now what? There weren't a lot of choices. The idea that there are choices now obviously really leads patient advocacy organizations to provide explanations so patients can be engaged in that process. I think that that's a really critical thing. And understanding the risk benefit is a challenge. Some people just do what their doctor tells them to, regardless. They're like, oh, my doctor said, and I'm not going to question. And when a doctor presents them with multiple options, then they do have to stop and they have to pick. And I think the more information that patients can get, the easier it is to understand what the pros and cons are. Dr. Gore, I'm not sure if you're smiling because what I just said or something else, but I think that you probably hear this all the time, like, oh, why are you giving me all these choices? But I do think it's a much better position to be in to have options than to only have, well, we need to take your bladder out. That's all we have left.
Thanks. One quick question for the clinical experts, perhaps, and it does relate in some ways to what insurers might be thinking too, but we've talked about the different evidence in the different subpopulations of patients, the high grade versus the carcinoma in situ. And I wonder, how does that play out clinically? Are people going to think that there's a different, better, is the best option going to be one, of these treatments for the high grade and a different one for the CIS? Or is it basically, in your minds clinically, or is it just going to get kind of lumped together? Aaron,
This is John. Yeah, this is John. I don't know that there's a lot to really distinguish them. The response rates are kind of similar, with respect to management of CIS. The differences are fairly subtle. And so again, it may come down a little bit to bladder symptoms, urinary symptoms, and sort of preceding history of treatments.
Okay, thanks. Aaron, anything you'd add? Looks like you're nodding your head. Okay. All right, let me leap over a conceptual wall here and take what we just heard from the doctors and patients about choices, about shared decision-making, the fact that there are multiple agents. Leslie and Jay, because I saw Jay is now with us, I'm putting on my payer's ear. I hear that and I might think, that's great. I've got competing agents. I've got doctors saying there's no one right drug for one right patient. So I can manage this. I can compete the drugs together. I can favor the lower priced agent and kind of set up my coverage criteria or even step therapy in a way to favor that approach. Do you think payers are going to hear it this way? This is cancer, it's oncology, not a place where step therapy, some of the other kind of tools of utilization management are frequently applied. What do you think they're going to do with this kind of information? Leslie, can I start with you?
Yes, you can hear me, correct?
I can.
Okay, great. So it's a really good question that you asked, and I'm gonna lump it into two different areas. I'm going to lump into the gemcitabine, that area, and then because of all the unknowns, I'm going to lump all the newer ones together, so gene therapy, et cetera, together, because those are the two different areas you're talking about, because it's two different, far different costs. Mm-hmm. So as far as one, could they step therapy? If what everybody has said today, could they step therapy some patients through the lower cost? There may be. Do I think there would be a lot of that? I'm really not actually, I'm not sure about that. And you've heard me, Steve, other times saying I'm more sure about things. But I'm going to throw out a host of other questions that will be asked at the same time. It's not just going to be on the efficacy, because if the newer ones actually do prove eventually to be, far worthier for all different reasons, you probably won't see as much step therapy. That being the case, though, I do believe that payers will want to identify the correct patients for these products. And what I mean this, and Karen, to your point, I really have to, I loved your point that you said it was uncomfortable, because we do have patients that can't withhold, they can't keep in for the amount of time that they have to. Although we did a lot of talking, but, again, one of the newer products, it is twice a week for 6 weeks, and then every week for 6 weeks after that. That is a lot to ask of a patient. we know that discontinuation rates in real life are not the discontinuation rates in the studies. Studies keep people on for longer. And what payers are going to want to avoid is wastage of medication, wasting patients' time, et cetera. So Steve, I go to more, what of all the other things? The other things that I think of are ECOG scores and all the studies. You did have that Eastern Cooperative Group performance status. I think it was 0 to 2 in most of them. Do they have other conditions, which everybody has alluded here to? So it's not only identifying what the particular type of bladder cancer is, but it's also identifying who can really tolerate what treatments. The last thing, and then I'll stop so that Jim can go on with this, is that after all the ASCO meetings I've been attending, and I have not gone to hear about bladder cancer and pembrolizumab. However, I have gone to hear about it in gastric cancer and lung cancer, et cetera. And what I do get from all the oncologists is that the side effects from those medications, the PD-1, PD-L1 inhibitors, are high, and they're beginning to look and see and to assess them a little bit more on the side effect rate. They used to compare it just with chemotherapy. They're very different, as we all know. There's the lung issues, et cetera. So I had to add that. I will stop.
No, that's good. I mean, I also would expect, given the kind of muddled view on effectiveness, by muddled, I just mean it's hard, as the CEPAC voted, it's really hard to distinguish the results on these treatments because they haven't been tested in a way that makes it easy to even do indirect comparisons. So the side effects, though, are easier to discuss with a patient, and the different types of them and the different pattern linked to the delivery mechanism. So I would also think that will be an important feature. Let me put it even a more sharp stinger at the end of this tale as I ask Jay to comment as well. And that is, again, if I could frame this very starkly in some way, we have evidence that cannot support one approach being better overall on average. We have one of the treatments, it's off-label, but it's been commonly used, costs $500. The others cost $150,000 a year. Is this where health plans are supposed to do something to get most patients to at least try the less expensive approach? Or again, is that not a road down which we should go? But it's a pretty stark difference, $500 versus $150,000. Wouldn't we want our health plans to be looking for opportunities where it was reasonable to try the $500 treatment instead? Jay, how do you think insurers, you don't have to say what you will do specifically, but how do you think they'll approach this kind of situation?
Sure. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Great. I think that's the conundrum, right? I think that's a question a lot of peers will be asking themselves. You know, that being said, payers like patients, like prescribers are all in the same boat in the fact that we like choices. That's how we are able to move forward. That being said, in this situation, you know, we do run into the fact that these are single-arm trials. There's lack of comparative data. It's preliminary data in many sense, and as the panel was discussing earlier, there's a lack of a long-term data. I think payers have been dipping their toe in managing the oncology space, whereas in years past they have not. And I suspect folks are going to look at this long and hard again.
So if you had to guess between Leslie and Jay, what % of payers out there will ultimately try some kind of step therapy with gemcitabine? And now we're talking about BCG first. So I'm assuming that patients have tried BCG. And at that stage, how many, just on a % basis, and I'm not sure if I'm meaning % of Americans or % of payers, if you had to guess, what % will either strongly consider it or implement actual formal step therapy here? Jay, what do you think? And then Leslie, this is your job, Leslie. You're supposed to know.
Yeah, I think it was Dr. Gore who made the comments as it relates to the guidelines and ultimately see where the guidelines fall out. I think that's going to help. That's going to help payers to figure out whether or not they're going to implement something like a step therapy treatment. Of course, that being said, I do think there will be a percentage. Steve, it's probably relatively small that will dip their toe as it relates to step therapy in this space.
And Jay, I totally agree with you. In fact, I'll throw out a number, but I'm going to qualify it too, because we have subscribers over all the United States, and I'd say there's probably between 10 and 20% of them who are actively engaging and doing a different oncology management programs, one way or the other. But I'm going to qualify it, as I said, also, because Steve, if you have more of a Medicare group versus a commercial, you're probably going to handle it a little bit differently, even though both commercial and Medicare patients can get this medication, that you potentially could see more Medicare patients in it. So if you have a stronger Medicare group, that may be a little bit harder, only because Medicare themselves has sort of rules and restrictions. Again, what you just said, if it's in the NCCN guidelines and they're all equivalent, it's a little bit easier to do that. So again, there's a lot of ifs, but I would say that right now around 10 to 20% of the of payers in the United States are actively doing some sort of oncology management. I do have to tell you, probably 60 to 70% are thinking about it. I'm not sure that start with this condition. There are other conditions that there's breast cancer and others that they usually start with.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, it's also interesting to know, I mean, NCCN, which is the set of guidelines that many payers look to for kind of guidance, so to speak. They don't mention these agents by name, but they say intravesicular chemotherapy is a reasonable option. So if you presume that gemcitabine and docetaxel fits there, then technically NCCN would bless that as an option, even though it's off-label. All right, so now let me circle back to the doctors and the patients and say, okay, 10 to 20% of the payers come to you and say, we want to do this. We want patients to be treated with gemcitabine as the first step. And if they fail that, the hard part is that if they fail that, then what? Does that mean that they get cystectomy and they've missed their chance at nadofaragene? Or could you do gemcitabine and then do nadofaragene after that? But as a clinical expert advising them, what would you think if they came to you saying, the cost difference here is just so big, the uncertainty of the data is so acknowledged, we really would like all our patients to get gemcitabine so we can keep premiums down? How would you respond?
Weird phase right now with PCORI where,
to be honest, this is John, to be honest, we don't often, and this is, a problem with clinical care, we don't often let cost intercede too drastically with a lot of our clinical decisions. And so I think it would depend really just on what we think is the comparative effectiveness of sort of the alternatives with respect to clinical health outcomes. And I think, that may be my own practice, but I think we observe across clinicians that we don't see a tremendous amount of importation of value into clinical decision-making discussions. I do think that that some of that nuance also, it really pertains to the heterogeneity of bladder cancer and bladder cancer recurrences. And I think that would also have an impact on some of those discussions.
Now, Stacy, thank you. I appreciate that comment. Stacy and Rachel might be able to do the math more quickly for me, but if I'm a Medicare patient and I'm prescribed a $500 a year treatment, I have a certain out-of-pocket that I might have to pay. If it's $150,000 a year, I have a much higher out-of-pocket to pay. So I assume that whether patients are bringing it up to you or not, There will be some for whom the $150,000 a year treatment could represent some significant financial burden for them or their family, even under Medicare. So I just wonder if the patient advocates also, is this something that you think about in terms of the choices that patients face, the cost burdens on them?
I'm going to say absolutely. I mean, for me, I was in a situation that, you know, I had really good insurance. I have a really great job. But that's not true for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
and there aren't a whole lot of programs out there that can help provide financial assistance. I know that we don't have anything in place where we could actually help somebody pay for their copay. So they do rely very heavily on some of the pharma partners that say, well, we can help you reduce the cost. So that's certainly not something that's an option within the surgical world for the most part, because you're not really dealing with a pharmaceutical company that can adjust the price based on their volume or whatever. So it's very different. But we do hear that quite often, that patients have a really hard time when they're faced with that choice of how they're going to pay for it.
So choice, as Jay said, choice is something that is valued by all participants in the healthcare kind of landscape. But it frequently does raise these kinds of questions of, does choice mean that we should make a value-based choice or a lower cost choice on you know, kind of on average, or should we try to mandate it? It gets kind of very difficult because it obviously restricts or could restrict the choices available to doctors and patients. Erin, I know, I'm not sure if you see these patients at this stage, but I wanted to give you a chance to comment. If you heard of a health plan that was doing step therapy with gemcitabine as the first agent of coverage, and you could not get nadofaragene, you could not get oportuzumab unless you had tried gemcitabine, how would you feel about that clinically?
As a health services researcher, I think that would be the appropriate decision. As a physician, I would, of course, be resistant to it, because for the exact same reasons that Dr. Gore was highlighting, that we would, I think there's a fair number of doctors, probably a majority, who would interpret it as like an imposition on their clinical autonomy, which is something that we value. And I think that goes for any form of step therapy or formulary restriction, even in cases where it is entirely warranted. And my personal view is that this would be one where that would be the case.
All right. Let me move on.
Can I just add one thing? Because Steve,
yes.
you mentioned, you know, choice. And I think that that's really important, because there are some patients that, you know, will choose the less expensive method because it's the less expensive, it has the least impact on them and their families. And then there's some that might be in a position where they might choose something else, and because their insurance company doesn't allow you to just jump ahead to a more expensive treatment, they might resent that fact that they have to choose the least expensive thing that might not work. So that's also an issue. And I think it comes down to patients should have that choice. They should have those options. And if they choose the least expensive method, that's their decision.
Now, one hypothetical kind of thought experiment that we sometimes do is, so what if it weren't 150,000? What if it were $1.5 million? Would you feel the same? Would you feel that insurers should let choice rule the system? What if it was $15 million? And we usually find that people say, yeah, that's not reasonable. And so it would be okay for an insurer to say, you can't use that one. And so it ends up being this weird sliding scale. At what point do we feel like it's okay to keep the choice? Is 150,000 the right number? Should it be 15,000 versus 500? And that's where sometimes it gets interesting. Let me move, actually, partly because of the time, but we want to talk about the cost and also talk about the future research. So let me bring in the manufacturers. Thank you for being patient as we did this. And I'm sure you might have had interesting comments to make on this other of us. Can you just remind us, how are physicians paid, by the way, for the services that would deliver these treatments? Are they paid as a percent of the cost, or are they paid a flat fee? Do you know anything about that could help inform the policy discussion around here. I'm sure the payers know too, but the manufacturers, do you know how the doctors are being paid?
I think they would have to speak to that.
Okay, well, maybe I'll ask.
Depends on the site of care, whether, where they're located, academic medical center, community center, or something like that. But I think they would have to speak to that.
Yeah, okay. Jay or Leslie, any quick comments on that? Because it may come into play in some of the other things we talk about. Are these ASP plus 3 or 6, or are these bundled in any way?
Usually done in the, I'll go, Jay, then you can. Usually done in the outpatient services. It's usually based upon the ASP, and then there's a cost for obviously the room, the facility charge, etc. Jay, if you may have a difference of.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything else to add. Yeah.
Okay, so if I'm a doctor and I'm in practice and I could give a $500 drug or $150,000 drug, I make a lot more money if I give the $150,000 drug in this situation, right? That's the way it's structured. Yep. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I've been in rooms in Washington, D.C. where people say, is that how the system really works? Maybe we should change that system. And yet it runs up against some barriers where people say, no, we need that money in the local community clinics to keep them going. That helps kind of keep us solvent, is that extra % on a high cost drug. But it creates some interesting incentives for doctors. So let me pivot back over to the manufacturers then. And maybe I'll ask the Fairgene. I apologize, I didn't pay attention as they came through. Would that be, yes, Kristen, it is you. So I'm kind of curious, how much do you have any idea how much it actually costs to make your treatment? Is that something that you have data on from internal?
No, I do not. Yeah.
Do you think anybody inside your company knows how much it costs to make?
Perhaps, yeah, I can, that could be something that we could follow up on. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm assuming that the price wasn't set because of how much it costs to make, because that's almost never the case when it comes to pharmaceuticals or other services, even in the healthcare system. We were part of a review of, we led a review of the very first gene therapy in American medicine. And it was priced at $850,000. It was a one-time treatment. Then we had a one-time treatment for a fatal condition of small children, and it was priced at $2.1 million. And we said that that price actually fit within kind of our value framework. How will you decide how to price your drug? On what, I mean, if you can try to avoid just the usual talking points about value to patients and society, you're gonna have to put numbers up on a graph and a chart. How are you gonna come up with a price for this?
So we do intend to price it responsibly based on the value that it provides as the first and only intravesical gene therapy for patients being treated with high-grade BCG unresponsive non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. And it's not a one-time treatment. It is, every 3-month treatment.
So are you going to look, I mean, when these documents have been subpoenaed by Senate and House committees, they show graphs in which they say at this price, the key opinion leaders will riot in the streets. If we reduce it by 10%, we'll have half of them on our side and half of them against us. So I assume that there's some assessment of the reaction of doctors, key opinion leaders to these prices. I assume there's a reaction to a graph that will show how tightly the payers will manage it. And at a lower price, payers will relax their access restrictions so that the lower the price, you get more access. But maybe that's a trade-off for your revenue. And at a higher price, again, the access starts to shrink. Is that, I'm not sure if you're in those rooms when those discussions are being made, but every time that those materials are subpoenaed, it comes out the same, no matter what company it is. So are those the kinds of considerations that will be done?
So, I mean, we're talking about bladder cancer where, I mean, there currently are no innovations. So, I work on the medical side, on the clinical development side, and not privy to all those conversations that are taking place, but yes, that is taken into consideration.
And so as far as, so you help design the clinical trials for the development program, you're part of that team? Right?
Yes, yes.
All right, now you feel like you're on better footing, I bet.
Yes.
So let me skip a little bit between the cost to the kind of research side.
Mhm.
I'm guessing that patients and doctors would have really loved to have seen a control arm in which gemcitabine or some other standard of care was compared to your treatment. It's certainly going to be what they would want going forward. Let me just play your consigliere for a second. I would say don't do that, because all you're going to do is risk showing that your drug isn't as good versus that old standard as people might think it's going to be. You don't want to try to market it on its relative comparativeness, comparative effectiveness and value to a really cheap older regimen. So just use a single arm trial. That's all the FDA is going to ask for. And then let the market kind of play out the way it usually does in oncology, which is $150,000 plus is kind of where the shooting starts. Now, that's me playing your Rudy Giuliani, if you will, forgive the political allusions. How did you decide to do the trials that you did in which there was no comparator arm?
So this actually goes back to 2012, when the Society of Urological Oncology and the AUA and the FDA actually got together to define a pathway for drug registration to actually stimulate drug development in this space for patients with BCG unresponsiveness. And actually that collaboration led to the acceptance of the single arm trial design to test novel therapies in these patients. And the primary endpoint that they determined was that we would look at complete response rate for patients with CIS, and then in anticipation of an incremental but meaningful improvement in outcomes compared to that with valrubicin, because that is actually the only drug that was approved in that space.
Right. So if we were in Germany, and I have no idea if this drug has been, or this treatment is being launched in Europe in any kind of specific timeline. I haven't looked at that. But I know how the German system works pretty well. And they would say, welcome to your regulatory approval. You get to price your drug however you want to for 1 year. And then we're going to ask you for the evidence of how it compares head to head with another standard of care. And if you don't have that, we're going to cut your price down to whatever that reference is for the lower cost agent. So at some point you do need those head-to-head trials, or you're going to have to accept the lower price. So how are you anticipating your launch in Europe and in other areas in which you will need those kinds of comparative data?
So I can just speak to what we're doing in the U.S. because our intention is to seek approval here in the U.S. And working with the FDA. I can't speak to the EU regulations. And what I can say also, with regards to gemcitabine, we don't have there is no approval for that as well in this patient population.
Right. Okay. Let me, and I know we're going to come back to research too. And so Rochelle, apologies. And now I want to really, where is Rochelle? Because once I see her, I will not forget her name again. Where is she? I'm sorry. There you are. Okay. Thank you for being patient. Okay. And thank you for working with us. I know, again, your treatment is also not priced in the market yet, but we were trying to figure out what a ballpark would be for considerations of cost effectiveness. And we really do appreciate the transparency that you showed in giving a general estimate that could be discussed. So you heard my somewhat flip description of the way that pricing works in the U.S. market. Cancer drugs, $100,000 a year used to be kind of, first it was shock and awe, and then it became the norm. Then it was 150,000 with shock and awe, and now it's the norm. And your president gave a very, I thought, well-spoken description of the goal of trying to come in and to help reduce the cost of care, to price responsibly. How would you respond to someone saying, without evidence of your superiority over gemcitabine and docetaxel, admittedly an off-label use, but one that has been commonly used and is within NCCN guidelines, We understand the pembrolizumab costs a little bit more than $150,000. So you may have said that's the target. And if we come in below then, we're being good corporate citizens. But does it seem possible? He said that the cost of goods, the cost of producing this treatment was relatively low. That might have been a hint that you could cut your price further if in competition you needed to. Is there any way that 150,000 doesn't have to be the starting launch price of drugs that are approved with single arm trials, with no long-term data? Are we stuck with $150,000 per year is where people think the normal starting point is? Oh, I'm sorry, we can't hear you. Maybe that's why you don't look muted, but you're not coming through on audio. I tell you what, I just asked a very long-winded question, and we're going to try to see if my staff can help work with you offline. You might have to end up calling in with your phone. Something's just not happening with your computer to be able to come through. All right, well, I'll give Kristen one more whack at that one, and we'll come back to Rochelle. But 150,000 seems to be the table stakes. Is that the way it should? I mean, table stakes for a gene therapy, you could say, is a lot higher. But as you said, you're not a one-time treatment, et cetera. But do you think there's a justification for $150,000 a year for treatments in cancer just because they're cancer? Oh, no, now you guys are trying to stay muted so you don't have to answer my question. There you go.
Yeah. I think that, you know, we in oncology, we take into consideration, you know, the development and the need for the patient. So I can't speak specifically to the price, you know, and the target, because, you know, we have not determined that. But yeah.
All right. Well, you can tell from my not too subtle bent to these questions that for a group that prides itself on trying to advance the idea that pricing should align with the benefit to patients, that there's a story to be told for a $2.1 million treatment based on its value to patients. There's a story to be told about a lower price for many other treatments so that we have the funds available to spend 2.1 when we have that kind of clinical home run. So it's the question of whether we're getting home runs and whether we need 150,000 for treatments that aren't, that I think is driving part of the policy discussion that may lead to step therapy. It may lead to other restrictions on access ultimately, because that's what has largely happened in other parts of the clinical landscape. Let me pivot over to, I'm sorry, somebody wanted to jump in.
Steve, I just wanted to say something about that 150,000 around that appropriate, annual cost, because I started off in 1980 or 85 at New England Medical Center doing pediatric oncology. So I have seen that go up very much so, that line go up. People are, I do have to tell you, are looking at that $150,000 cost per year and doing things and about it to try to mitigate it somewhat. So I just need that known. One of the things that Keytruda itself, they're beginning to look at weight-based dosing back to what the original studies were, not in the bladder cancer, which is still either the 200 or 400 milligram definitive dose every 3 or 6 weeks. However, in some of the other areas, such as lung cancer, they are looking at weight-based dosing to get that that amount down, that annual cost down. Likewise, there is contracting and rebating. So I just needed to sort of talk about in general that $150,000 or so per year. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm not suggesting that the 150 is rock solid, but oncology is one area where we see many fewer rebates, certainly of a substantial side, even when there's competition within classes. All right, with the time left, I want to make sure we give the Policy Roundtable a chance for a final statement. I did want to have one last little debate, and it's about randomized controlled trials. So Kristen gave the story about when it was decided, and it was a pretty universally acknowledged standard that in this area, the FDA would only require single-arm trials, and there would be a threshold for effectiveness that would be used. Do we need to stay in that world, or do we shift now? Should we have ever said that it was okay to have a single-arm trial? I think I'll start with the clinical experts, but the evidence-based medicine people throw up their hands and they say, please give us randomized trials, or at least some kind of eligibility criteria that would allow us to do better indirect comparisons, because we hate the kind of muddied water that we end up splashing around in without them. So are there good reasons that we need to stick with single-arm trials for innovative therapies in this space, or is that yesterday's news? Aaron?
I don't see a compelling rationale for single-arm trials in this space. I think there are very few where there would be such a rationale, and I don't think this would be one.
John, what do you think?
So I will say I'm not super familiar with the FDA regulatory standards with respect to this. And so I don't know how the FDA would consider some of the candidate comparators. I think it might be hard from the FDA's perspective to consider, for example, the alternative that we've been discussing a lot today, gemcitabine and docetaxel, as the standard based on the currently available evidence. I think one of the things that we struggle with in surgical trials, and bladder cancer is a surgical disease, and we're surgeons, is sometimes the comparison is not readily available. There was a practice-changing trial in bladder cancer that utilizes gemcitabine as a post-resection installational agent, and it was a single-arm cooperative group trial that changed practice. And there was an argument for why it was a single-arm trial, because the community practice standard was to do nothing. And I think the challenge in this clinical space still today is that there is no standard salvage, first-line treatment. And so I agree, in an ideal world, we would have high-level RCT-based evidence. I do often cite that BMJ article about the parachute because I think it's relevant that relying only on RCT-based evidence is a little bit of a fallacy. I think here the problem is what is the comparator, what is the standard, and per my purview as someone that takes care of these patients, I don't see that there is one.
Yeah, there's really to be honest, there's nothing that distinctive about this in salvage therapy in any branch of medicine. People throw the kitchen sink at it, or they do nothing, and everything in between. In our experience, most of the time that single-arm trials seem to be, I think, both relevant and useful are when the natural history of usual care is clearly defined. And it's when it's not that it increases the need for a randomized trial. And that's the situation I think we find ourselves in here. The natural history of usual best supportive care is a kind of almost unknown. So you can create any protocol you want to. We're looking at one in lupus nephritis where there's no standard of care. There are different ones. And so you just pick one, you make one up, but it helps give some solidity and some relevant kind of comparative aspects. So I think my hope is that the field will get the signal from the clinical community and from the payer community that innovation has done its job. We've got a handful of new treatments, but it's time to start being able to assess their comparative effectiveness better. And to do that, we'll probably need some randomized trials. At least that's my hope. Let me toss it back to Rochelle, whom I think is now back with us on audio. Do you remember the question I asked, or you can almost answer any of them since? But now you are muted on your own system there. Unless, did you use your phone instead?
I'm on my phone now.
Yay, now we can hear you.
Okay, good. I'm not sure what happens between the intro and the question from how I lost my audio. I'm not sure.
Okay. Sorry about that. So I guess the question I asked you, if you'd like to take a swing at it, was the 150,000. It felt like, all of the different things we can talk about in terms of value-based pricing, value to society, competitive landscape. Close your eyes. You can pretty much guess that when you open them, the price will be around 150,000. So is that, I guess part of my question is that the best way for the system to work? Is there a better way that we could scale prices to match the benefits to patients Do you think this is just the way that the system will work no matter what, and it's the right way for it to work, which is that there's a standard opening price around 150,000?
Well, I don't know necessarily that our pricing was based on what's considered to be standard. I think everything is put into context of the actual benefit it provides for the patient. When you look at the recurrence-free rates, the complete response rates, the delay on cystectomy, I mean, these are major benefits to patients. And then when you put that into perspective of the cost of manufacturing the drug, et cetera, I think everything comes into play. But I mean, as of right now, we don't have a price point set.
Right.
This is something we will be discussing with payers, et cetera, in order to formalize this. But it was something just for the evaluation purpose. We had to set a price to try and make an economic evaluation feasible.
Totally understand. Thank you. Let me close out this section by reflecting back with the patients again. Some patient groups that we've worked with are violently interested in getting better evidence, and they push the manufacturers. And they have formal get-togethers where they say, you're not doing the right kinds of research to get us the information we need. You're not looking at patient-centered outcomes. You're not doing enough of the right kinds of study designs. I don't know if the patient community in bladder cancer is kind of organized enough in that way to have those kinds of conversations. But if you do reflect what you think the patient community would want from the evidence going forward, how would you frame it? Karen and Stephanie.
Well, I mean, from my perspective and the folks that I know through Beacon, I think we're a force to be reckoned with. And there's certainly would be enough people to represent this question and, you know, ask for what we want going forward. I myself, you know, it's my opinion only that I would like better evidence because you know, the standard of care, you know, there's really not good data and numbers, and it makes it very difficult for a patient to make a decision.
By the way, you have one of the best acronyms. We're kind of proud of ours, but Beacon is pretty good. It's pretty good. Well done. Stephanie, would you like to add in anything to that?
Get off mute. Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, we consider ourselves like a beacon of hope. I think that that's really an important aspect of what we do. And I do know that patients are very interested in the outcomes of science and the evidence and what is being looked at. That's been the focus of our recent scientific advisory meeting that we did, our think tank this year, not last year, but it was a virtual meeting that was specifically focused on endpoints for BCG refractory patients. And I think that that was really critical. We have a group of patients that are very, very involved and engaged. Karen is one, who work with our pharma partners to help make sure that that patient voice is very involved. We have a number of patients who have participated in the development of clinical trial and research proposals for things like CDMRP, because their behavioral health studies require patient involvement. And we've gotten a number of grants years ago from PCORI to really take a look. And I think that patients want not just, you know, to extend the curve on the Kaplan-Meier chart to say, well, you know, we bought you 3 more months. Well, 3 more months of a miserable life is not really getting you much. They really want quality of life, and they want to have this be something that is attainable. And I think that that's really important. And, you know, we do have a really robust group of people that want to get involved and engage in that process. If that's really what you're looking for. We appreciate when pharma partners ask us for that patient voice, because you can talk about extending somebody's life by 3 months and seeing that as statistically significant. But again, if it's 3 months of living through a miserable existence, you're not really giving them any value to that time. And not if it's going to cost them everything in their bank. So I think you really have to weigh those pros and cons.
Thank you. That was fantastic. All right. So actually, that's a great time for me to pivot to a final chance for you all to have your say before we go back to the Midwest CEPAC. What we'd like to do is to invite you to have, again, a last statement that if you can keep it to just one sentence, especially given the time that we have, and it can be just the theme that you think is the most important for the meeting to leave kind of in their ears. It can be a request that you would have of one of the other major stakeholders, one thing that they could do to make the world a better place. Anything you'd like to state of that nature would be great. Could I start with the payers? And again, we'll try to be brief so we have time for everybody. Leslie, what would your final message be?
Yeah, and I would just throw out that patient identification, who can actually tolerate the therapy, what therapy they can tolerate, et cetera, is going to be extremely important. And like everybody else, need more information. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Jay?
Yeah, I'm going to echo the same comments. So again, we have limited data today. We have a lack of comparative data, and we would love to see more long-term data.
Okay, thanks very much. Kristen?
Yeah, I will say that that's very important to us as well. And it's not just conducting clinical trials, but actually capturing real-world evidence, patient-reported outcomes. Going forward, any clinical trials that we are planning, we actually do collaborate with our patient advocacy group with Beacon and listen to patients and their perspective. But yes, that's very important to us.
Thanks very much. Rochelle?
Yeah, thanks. I think at the end of the day, we all have the same goal, and it's to improve the lives of people with bladder cancer. From that perspective, moving forward with clinical trials, if we're to do a comparator trial or a confirmatory trial, it is in the space of a comparator arm. So that is our goal, to be able to actually have a comparative outcome in that respect, and also to include quality of life as outcome measures as well. So I think those are important things.
Thank you. That we would love to see that too. Aaron?
One sentence.
Yeah.
I'll extrapolate from my experience with metastatic prostate cancer, metastatic renal cell cancer, and say having more choices isn't necessarily a good thing when you don't know which of those choices is the best one.
That was almost haiku. I like that. Thank you. A very important message. John?
I would follow on that just by saying, at the same time, it's good to have choices.
So noted. All right. And again, final word to our patients before we go back to the Midwest CEPAC. You guys can thumb wrestle again over it. Stephanie?
Well, I'm going to go ahead and start, and then Karen can wrap it up. Bring it home, Karen. But I just want to say Beacon was started 15 years ago. The fact that we're actually having this conversation, granted over Zoom, which is a little bit unheard of 15 years ago, but the fact that we're having a conversation about choices for those non-muscle invasive patients that don't respond to BCG is something that I think our, founding patient, John Qualley, would be incredibly proud of. And I think that we just need to keep this conversation and this effort going to find more options, because the right combination of an affordable treatment that fits almost everybody will be found at some point. And I'm very excited that this is a conversation that we're actually having. Karen, take it away.
Well, I'm going to say that I like choices. I think they're very important because it's not one size fits all. What works for one patient doesn't necessarily work for another one. So that's what I'd like to see.
Folks, thank you so much for your time on the call today and for the insights that you provided. some of you know this, but not just in the report, but our videos are frequently watched, and we actually curate them to capture some of the key moments that patients and clinical experts have to share, as well as the whole roundtable. So on behalf of the whole Midwest CEPAC, who I hope will join me, I just want to thank all of you for your time and your insights that you've given us today. Very, very helpful. With that, I'll hand it back over to the chair, who can run. Actually, I usually do this part, so I guess maybe I'll continue to do it. So same thing for the Midwest CEPAC. You guys get less than a minute each to try to have a very simple, if you will, but final statement to send us out. So if we can put the slide down and I can see people, I will just run the table here. Aaron, can I start with you? Aaron Carroll?
It won't let me start my video, which I apologize for.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because the host has stopped it. There we go. Now I can start it. There we go. You know, as always, I think it's heartening to see the process work, that we try to bring all sides together and try to have a civil discussion about all of this. So this remains like one of the few activities that I genuinely try to make sure that I get to keep doing, because I think that the whole process is worthwhile and admirable.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Kurt.
Yeah, I appreciate all the speakers and the panelists today. I appreciate ICER taking a look at this topic and looking at these two therapies with novel mechanisms of action. We've already shared some opportunities going forward, having active comparator groups, standardizing endpoints, and also, of course, getting longer term data. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. Who do I got? Scott.
Thanks to everyone involved today. And the words that I kept jotting down were comparative effectiveness and more data and those types of things. And I think with stakeholders like this, we can do those types of things, not necessarily randomized controlled trials, but through registries like at Memorial Sloan Kettering, partnering with industry and so on, so that we can get that data and make more informed decisions, be it in a controlled clinical trial or observationally.
Thanks very much. Rachel?
Yeah, so thank you everyone for taking the time to join us and share your expertise with us. I just want to agree with what Scott just said. I'm very excited that patients have new options for treatments, but I continue to be really disappointed by the lack of evidence that we have in support of these products, particularly as compared to existing therapies. And to be clear, it's not just a problem for us or for insurers. It really does a disservice to patients and physicians as they're trying to make choices about what treatments are best for them under the circumstances.
Thanks very much. Bijan?
Thanks so much again, giving us the opportunity to hear your voice. And I think as Scott pointed out, it seems data would be the key, and we probably will have to have some sort of registry for these patients so that we would get data kind of going forward, and then that would help us basically, compare comparators basically long-term outcomes that hopefully we would get to see and make really kind of informed decisions.
Thanks very much. Sorry, Reem.
Well, thanks again to ICER for taking this topic and other topics that are very challenging on. I just want to, as I was listening to all this, I think it's quite interesting to look at how there are different cultures in different clinical areas, and what is acceptable as an evidence base in one area may not be in another area. And now as oncology outcomes are better than many of the chronic diseases outcomes, I think it is fair to say we really need, lack of this comparative evidence does hinder everybody's ability to decide what is the best option and management pathway for certain patients. And I just want to remind all of us, especially in the COVID-19 era, we know that pragmatic large clinical trial can happen, and they are real world evidence. So even in areas like these, some interactive designs, new designs can apply to identify the best clinical course and area. Thanks to the patients for reminding us. And I hope that the patients will be the one who, and the advocacy group will be the one who actually hold this message and require this better evidence from all of us. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Tim.
I'm just going to add to the choir here. I was going to say something about how important comparative effective evidence was, but so I'll just add to that choir, but also say that we were having a chat about the issue of underinsurance. So what is the price going to be? And it's going to be really important that it's always important that choice matters, but it's going to be important that people have access to affordable choices. So what's the ultimate price and to the patient going to be? And we don't know that yet. So we always have to be mindful of that.
Thanks very much. Stacy.
So I don't want to belabor the same comments as pretty much everyone else here, but I do remain encouraged that there are more treatment options, but I'm incredibly frustrated by the lack of comparative data. I think that's really hard for all of us. It's really hard for patients and physicians as well. So I look forward to the day when we have better comparative information on these products.
Thank you very much. Angela?
Thank you again to all the panelists, especially our patient groups, from sharing your perspective. I think I echo all of the comments that have been shared today, and just really just want to emphasize, definitely, hopefully we can develop choices that are not only affordable, but also improve the quality of life of our patients. So thanks for ICE for taking this on, and I hope we have future data that is better and available.
Thank you very much. Ingva.
Yeah, thanks for letting me audit this today. It was my first time, so it was very exciting to see how people discuss this. And I'm looking forward to future CEPAC meetings. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you. Bradley?
I'll add on to the need where this provides opportunities for real-world evidence. I think that it's going to be tough to have these comparative trials. Also, I was hoping Dan would be on, but he and I had some private discussion. I think he got the estimate right. The figure that I drew it from was labeled complete response. When you look at the data, it was right. And I'm looking forward to voting next time.
We know someone will be keeping us honest. That's good. All right, Kelly, I see you there. Good.
Yeah, thanks. I would just ditto what a lot of people have said, but as a person who has bladder issues as a result of a spinal cord injury 50 years ago, and someone who's lost their wife to cancer, I found this discussion really interesting, but just want to say cancer really does suck. And having a lack of data here really did frustrate me as well. And so, but I really enjoyed the conversation, and I enjoyed the first meeting I really had as a voting CEPAC member. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And Alan.
Yeah, I would maybe just add something a little bit different, and maybe it's beyond the scope, I guess, of ICER technically, but I think it's in the same vein. I think we can't lose sight of the need and the opportunity to construct in a systematic way value-based decisions at the individual patient level. So while it's important to do this work and think about it at the sort of at the public level or at the higher level, I think there is opportunity when you do have choice like this, and insurance may be low to force choices upon people because maybe there's not clear evidence about what the best option is. There is a need and an opportunity to engineer a more systematic and conscientious way to facilitate value-based choices between patients and clinicians. And we didn't talk about that. And again, I can see why, but I think that's something not to forget, that while we're introducing choice and we may see that as a good thing, there are other means by which to help manage those choice selections at the individual level that revolve around the concept of value and introducing cost into those individual discussions.
Yeah, actually, it's a really good point. I'll handing over to Eric in a second. And many of us are aware of the kind of the history of prostate cancer and how, as the evidence got better and the choices expanded, there was a zone in which shared decision-making was almost kind of trialed in prostate cancer with interactive kind of modules that patients could use, that doctors could use, and back and forth. So bladder cancer, due to its success in having multiple treatment options, might be a ripe environment in which to think about some new kind of shared decision-making tools that would, in some ways, be more precise and nuanced and tailored than any insurance product could be in trying to achieve better value. It's a really good point. Eric, you get the last CEPAC word before I'll have 2 seconds on the end.
Just thanks to all of our participants today, patients, clinical experts. You've added a lot. I learned a lot in this particular case. I think this case is an example for me of that, innovation that's unaffordable is not innovation, right? It may be scientifically interesting, but if it doesn't reach, if it doesn't actually create incremental value over what we currently have, then those innovations are, they're not delivering the value that I think that we are hoping that science delivers, not just in cancer care, but everywhere. So just sort of walk away from a case like this and wonder, is the FDA just set low expectations for driving innovation by not requiring certain standards of evidence? I'm not saying that things can't be trialed, but that's kind of my walk away on this one, is that maybe we've just lowered the bar a bit too much when it comes to driving innovation. So, and not we, right, but our government as the FDA does it. So thank you, everybody, for always an amazing civil dialogue. And I'm kind of with Aaron on this one, that, these meetings are a bright spot in my academic, career. And it's probably the most academic thing that I do. And it's not even related to my own university. So I appreciate everything from all of y'all. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. So in my just kind of sign off, I do think it's very true. We get the evidence that our system is built to provide. I mean, it's, you get the results that you manufacture in the structure. The structure of what the FDA is supposed to do is not meant always to come up with good comparative data. If payers and patients and the clinical societies are going to accept, low-level data, then that's what we will get. Because there's really no reason for companies generally to spend extra money and time getting data that could put their products at risk in some ways. We can't expect them to do that unless the system incentivizes them to do so. So I hope we can contribute a little bit to that by certainly highlighting the evidence gaps, but it's got to be part of a broader structure. And we are starting now, actually, we'll be piloting this soon, and I'll make the public offer to BCAN. We are open to co-producing letters to the FDA and to other stakeholders about where we need the evidence generation to go for all the parties to be making better decisions. But I just think it is going to be really important. The reason I feel the most upbeat today is not only is it a Friday, but it's because BCAN, as represented by you two, shows great promise. I mean, it's early in a sense because you've been working at it for 15 years, but now suddenly you've got all these new treatments on the pipeline. And I think you've got your eye firmly on the ball. So my hope is that you will have a strong voice at the table on the research needs, on what matters to patients. Work with your partners, and that's the right term, work with all your partners. And personally, I think it's very important that you take that opportunity to recognize your power to bring witness to the difficulties of affordability and what that means for patients. I mean, we can talk about it at the system level and those diagrams of people in a circle and all that. You guys hear from the people who on a day-to-day basis have difficulty with the cost. And it's an important part of what I hope the patient community will take on as part of its mission, because you guys have, I think, an important voice. And I'm really glad that you're engaging on that level as well. So better evidence, more affordable outcomes, a continued pipeline of innovative treatments that we can price in alignment with their improvements for patients. And maybe we'll be here in another couple of years talking about another set of great treatments for folks with bladder cancer. I certainly hope so. In the meantime, my thanks to the patient folks who came, to all the different policy roundtable members, to the Midwest CEPAC. You guys are amazing. Great digestion of our report and of all the different issues on the table. We will be doing our very best to capture some of the richness of this discussion and the votes, and we'll be putting out a final report in a couple of weeks. I think a slide is about to show you that. But while that comes up, let me just thank you again. I hope you all have a safe and wonderful Thanksgiving. And thank you all again. We'll see you soon. That's good.